Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 Cushwa Center Lecture. My name is David Lantigua. I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Theology, and along with my colleague Darren Dochuk, I co-direct Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. I want to thank you all for joining us on this beautiful fall afternoon. Welcome especially to those of you who may be attending a Cushwa Center event for the first time. I'm so delighted and gratified to introduce Robert Ellsberg as our speaker today. He is no stranger to Notre Dame over the years, yet we could not think of a more fitting person to honor 50 years of the center for our Cushwa lecture this year. Robert is publisher, executive director, and editor-in-chief at Orbis Books. He began as editor of Orbis in 1987, but his career began years earlier with his involvement in the Catholic worker movement, which he joined at age 19. Robert first worked in publishing as the managing editor of the Catholic Worker, the newspaper published by the Catholic worker community in New York City. During his 2 years at the paper, he was introduced to Dorothy Day. He worked with Day for the last 5 years of her life, an experience that led to his conversion to Catholicism. He went on to study religion, literature at Harvard, and he earned a master's in theology from Harvard Divinity School before later going to Orbis Books. Robert is the author and editor of numerous books, some of which are on sale outside, including Lead, Kindly Light, Gandhi on Christianity, All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses of Our Time, Blessed Among All Women, Reflections on Women, Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses of Our Time, which tied in an all-time Catholic Press Association record by winning multiple awards. The Duty of Delight, The Diaries of Dorothy Day, Dorothy Day's Spiritual Writings, and his newest book, right here, Blessed Among Us, Day by Day with Saintly Witnesses, Volume 2, which was just published by Liturgical Press this year. Orbis Books was founded in 1970 by the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers with the mission of amplifying the Church's voices from the Global South. In response to the Second Vatican Council, Orbis has published influential works by theologians, ministers, pastors that include Kelly Brown Douglas, Gustavo Gutiérrez, Elizabeth Johnson, Kwok Pui Lan, Peter Phan, Oscar Romero, John Sobrino, James Cone, the list goes on. Orbis has also published many spiritual classics, including works by Thomas Merton, Thérèse of Lisieux, Henri Nouwen, and Mother Teresa. The publishing house's catalog has tracked and influenced major developments in Catholic theology across the Americas, including the rise of liberation theology amid tensions with the Vatican, the turn to world Christianity and interreligious dialogue, and landmark contributions in eco-theology and Black theology. Orbis has a long-standing reputation for leading the theological conversation over the decades. With the election of Pope Francis in 2013, themes that had long been focal points for Orbis, such as the preferential option for the poor and ecological spirituality, took center stage in the teaching and ministry of our first Latin American Pope. Now, with Leo XIV, the first US-born Pope shaped by the missionary church of Latin America, Robert's leadership at Orbis Books represents the nexus of a true world church comprised of the global North and South. As Orbis Books, like the Cushwa Center, enters its second half-century, we are grateful to Robert for joining us to reflect on the work of the great institution he has led for almost 4 of its 5.5 decades. The title of his lecture this afternoon is Publishing and Service to the World Church, My Life at Orbis Books. Please join me in welcoming Robert Ellsberg.
Do I click on this little thing, or do I press that to change the?
Just push that button there.
Okay, press this button.
Yeah,
like
that one to move through the slides.
Like that?
I think so.
Is it showing? There we go. Oh, it's working. Okay. And you mind, excuse me, if I just have a start off here with a little refreshment. I'm really honored to be invited here, especially for this very important anniversary, 50 years. And when they asked me what I'd like to speak about, I realized that this is a lecture I really wanted to give for a long time, but I had to be around for a long time to be able to do it, to talk about the role of Orbis Books over the last half a century, like the Cushwa Center. First time I came to Notre Dame was 26 years ago, and I told my young daughter that I was coming to Notre Dame, and she said, "Oh, take a picture of the bell." I said, "The bell?" She'd just seen the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I said, that's a different Notre Dame. And she said, "Well, do they at least speak French?" I said, "But of course." The name of the university here, of course, where we are, is a reminder of the European roots of the Catholic Church in America. Immigrants and missionaries from France and many other countries made their way to this continent, whether in cities in the East or here on the remote outposts of the American frontier. And so where we sit today is an extension of the worldwide missionary movement in the church. But today, I would like to look at a wider and more recent era in the life of the church, the emergence of a global, or as Karl Rahner put it, a world church. This is not a church whose center is Rome or Europe, or for that matter, the West. It's a church without a center, enculturated into the language, history, and culture of every set corner of the globe. And what is more, not rooted in the centers of power or privilege, but in the world of the poor, and what Pope Francis called the margins and peripheries. And I want to tell this story through the history of a particular publishing house, Orbis Books, where I happen to have worked for over 38 years. Orbis was, in a sense, founded on the crest of this wave of globalization. And that gives our history a particular vantage point on this story of the church over the past half century, where it has come from and where it may be going. And I apologize if that demands a degree of autobiographical reflection, since this is also, to some extent, the story of my life. I think the place to start this story is with Vatican II, which concluded in 1965. We're still, in many ways, trying to live out the vision of the Council. Much of the renewal of that time, the work of bishops and far-sighted theologians, many from Germany and France, was aimed at opening the church to the positive features of the modern world: democracy, religious liberty, a sense of historical consciousness. Most of all, the Council replaced the conception of a static, ahistorical church, largely defined in terms of opposition to modernity, with the image of a pilgrim people of God moving through history, alert to the signs of the times and the presence of the Spirit. Of course, the logic of this renewal entailed the possibility of ongoing development and evolving understanding of the gospel in relation to new experiences and questions, especially the experience of new subjects asking these questions. In many respects, the Council had responded to questions posed by Christians in the developed West, but Karl Rahner was among those, the first to identify what he called the most important significance of the Council. This was, he said, the first council of a world church. In fact, he called this the most significant paradigm shift in the church since the first century move from a primarily Jewish movement to a church of the Gentiles. For Rahner, this shift was immediately signaled by the participation of bishops from Africa, Asia, and particularly Latin America. But he recognized that the logic and impetus of the council was to break the old image of the church as essentially a European church with foreign outposts. The vernacularization of the liturgy was just one sign of an openness to local culture, traditions, and history. But there was another promise of the council less recognized at the time in Pope John XXIII's statement that the church wishes to be the church of everyone, especially the poor. And the fulfillment of this logic came just 3 years later after the council with the famous meeting of the Latin American Bishops' Conference in Medellin, Colombia in 1968. The agenda of the meeting was to apply the lessons of the council to their own continent. That response was shaped especially by Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, which began with the words, "The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ." Using the see, judge, act method, the bishops first began by analyzing the situation of Latin America, which they identified in terms of massive poverty, oppression, and violence. They defined this as a situation of structural sin. In response, they called for the church to take up a prophetic option for the poor. This pointed to a whole new understanding of evangelization, the pastoral strategy of the church, new ways of reading the Bible, new forms of ministry in ecclesial communities. And out of this new way of reflecting on the gospel, there arose a new way of doing theology. The foundational text was by a Peruvian priest, no stranger to Notre Dame, Gustavo Gutiérrez, who speaks French, who would later leave his mark on this university. His book, A Theology of Liberation, was published in 1971. It opened the floodgates on a library of works by such figures as Leonardo Boff, Ernesto Cardenal, John Sobrino, Juan Luis II, Ivona Guevara, and Ignacio Echecorria. It also fostered a new generation of prophetic bishops like Dom Helder Camara and Oscar Romero of El Salvador. Their work uncovered the social dimensions of Christ's ministry and message, beginning with his inaugural sermon where he said that he'd come to bring liberty to the captives and good news to the poor. And that pointed to a new way of being church and new strategies for pastoral action, which must go beyond serving the poor to joining them in the struggle for justice and liberation. Their work evoked enormous hopes for the poor of Latin America and elsewhere, but also fears and challenges, both political and theological. In many capitals of the world, Gutiérrez was seen as a dangerous radical. What was the fearsome content of his book? Like all great theologians, Father Gutiérrez wrestled with the problem of how to talk about God in terms of the questions posed by his historical moment. For many modern theologians, that question involved the meaning of faith in an age of reason and skepticism, the challenge of the non-believer. For Gutiérrez, the question was how to talk about God in relation to the suffering of the poor, the challenge of the non-person. This was not an academic question. It was posed by the reality outside the window of his parish of Rimac, a poor neighborhood in Lima, where he served for many years as pastor. This was a vantage point shared by most of the world's population. And yet for most theologians from Europe and North America, this reality remained on the level of an anecdote, literally beneath their radar. For Gutiérrez, the suffering of the innocent didn't call into question the existence of God. Instead, it called into question the injustice of the world's social structures and the shameful complacence of the church. The God of life, revealed in Scripture and in Jesus Christ, challenged all Christians to make a preferential option for the poor. And just as the theologians of Vatican II, Rahner, Hans Kung, Yves Congar, had their English-speaking publishers like Sheed & Ward, Crossroad, so did the Theology of Liberation, and that brings me to Orbis Books. Orbis was founded in 1970 as the publishing arm of the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, a missionary society. It was the brainchild of a visionary missionary, a Maryknoll priest, Nicaraguan-born Miguel de Scoto, who conceived that the time was ripe for a publishing house that would amplify theological voices from what was then called the Third World. The timing was clearly auspicious. In any previous time, this would have been a vain undertaking. Before this, there were certainly theologians in the global South, but there was no such thing as Third World or Latin American theology. There was just, as we naively thought, theology, the same whether taught in Rome or Notre Dame or Manila. There was no sense that theology is shaped by social or cultural contexts, or as Gutiérrez would say, what do you see when you look outside your window? And I have to acknowledge my friend Steve Bevins, whose book, Models of Contextual Theology, we published 35 years ago. Miguel saw in Orbis an opportunity to evangelize the rich of North America through the voices of the poor. And he began by touring Latin America and returning with armloads of books to be translated. The name Orbis is, of course, Latin for world. And over time, this came to imply more than Miguel had initially realized. In the early years, our understanding of the world was defined in terms of the opposing global blocks, First World and Third World. Another way of putting that would be the world of those who take for granted their next meal and those who don't. Yet the story of Orbis over the next 55 years has in part been a record of our sometimes stumbling efforts to realize, explore, and live out the wider implications of our name and our understanding of what constitutes the world. The foundation stone was published in 1973 with the publication of Gutiérrez's seminal book. That was followed by more than 100 other Latin American titles over the following years, and for a long time, that was essentially what Orbis was known for. And it's important to recall the historical context at that time of military dictatorships that dominated the continent of Latin America, from Nicaragua and El Salvador to Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and elsewhere. These regimes were distinguished by brutal repression, rising in the case of Guatemala to virtual genocide. One of our landmark works was the Gospel of Solentiname by the Nicaraguan poet and priest Ernesto Cardenal, who was a former Trappist novice under Thomas Merton. His book recorded reflections on the Gospels by members of his community of peasants and artisans, and it gave a flavor of the way that many grassroots or base communities in Latin America were applying the gospel to their own situation. In this case, the reflections drew inevitable analogies between the opposition and violence that Jesus confronted in the Roman Empire and the repression of the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. Here's a commentary on Jesus' inaugural sermon in Nazareth. A campesino named William reflects, he's saying that he's the one. It's a message of pure liberation, the poor, the afflicted, the blind, the imprisoned. Another, Laureano, observes, the truth is that all these people, they're the poor. And another, Pedro, says, and you have to see as a contrast the negative part too. He didn't come to give any news to the rich, but to talk to the poor. He didn't come to give health to those who are happy, but to those who have problems, to the afflicted. He didn't come to be the ally of those who put people in jail, but to free the prisoners. And he didn't come to blindfold people's eyes, but to make them see. And he didn't come to oppress, but to put an end to oppression and to proclaim total liberation. Let nobody falsify these words, as it often happens. And he said it in church. This kind of reflection was inspiring or terrifying, depending on your perspective. Somoza's National Guard subsequently destroyed the community of Solentiname, prompting many of its members to join the Sandinista guerrillas. With the victory of the Sandinista Revolution in 1979, Cardinal and our founder, Father Miguel de Escoto, assumed positions in the revolutionary government. Meanwhile, as the church through the 1970s and 80s came increasingly to identify with the poor, Christians were regarded as dangerous subversives, and theologians, clergy, religious, and lay people were among the targets of violent repression. As Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador said, one who is committed to the poor must risk the same fate as the poor, which, as he noted in El Salvador, meant to disappear, to be tortured, to be captive, to be found dead. And so we were seeing a replay of the early Church of the Martyrs. Like those who went before, these new martyrs were killed for their obedience to the God of life, their defiance of the idols of death. In 1980, that included Oscar Romero himself, who was assassinated while saying Mass, and later that same year, 4 North American churchwomen, including 2 Maryknoll sisters who were raped and murdered by the Salvadoran military. All this was tangled up with U.S. foreign policy, and it generated a fervent solidarity movement among Christians in the U.S. And all of this was the context in which we were publishing. At the same time, this new model of church and theology in Latin America was arousing serious concerns and resistance from Rome. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued 2 documents on liberation theology. Many saw figures like Romero as dividing the church and playing politics. Theologians like Boff and Gutiérrez were charged with drawing on Marxism and replacing the vision of the kingdom of heaven with a vision of earthly utopia. This also played into the Cold War politics of the time. The Reagan administration saw the struggles in Central America as an important front in the battle against Soviet influence. They saw liberation theology and its prophetic theologians as agents of communism, and they turned a blind eye to their persecution. Many of our authors were subjected to investigation, silencing, or other restrictions. The most prominent case was that of the Brazilian Franciscan Leonardo Boff, who was twice ordered to maintain obsequious silence. The first time he obeyed, saying, "I would rather walk with the church than alone with my theology." But when the restrictions were renewed, he made the decision to leave the priesthood. In a letter to what he called my companions on the path of hope, he wrote, "To be unfaithful to what gives sense to one's life is to lose one's dignity and to diminish one's identity. This I will not do, nor do I think that God wants this of us." Nevertheless, he took pains to stress that he was not leaving the church or abandoning his vocation as a theologian. "I continue to be and will always be a theologian in the Catholic and ecumenical mold, fighting with the poor against their poverty and in favor of their liberation." And at Orbis, we continue to publish his works right up to the present. Throughout these years, Orbis was also operating under a cloud of ecclesiastical suspicion, as well as attacks from conservative corners in the US who charged that we were also agents of communism. When Maryknoll superiors visited the office of Vatican officials, they were often confronted with letters of complaint or marked up copies of our catalog. The theologian of the Bishops' Committee on Doctrine, who had later distinguished himself by declaring Pope Francis a heretic, visited Maryknoll to investigate the oversight of our program. At one point, Cardinal Egan of New York called to say he wanted all Orbis titles to be subject to imprimaturs. I have to note that although we seemed for many years to walk on a razor's edge, we managed, with support from Maryknoll, to finesse these ordeals, and we were never formally reproved nor instructed to withdraw any book from publication. But this was not a parlor game. I remember when John Sobrino, on his way to the airport for a retreat in Thailand in 1989, mailed us the foreword to a new book about El Salvador. While he was out of the country, he was awakened by a call from a friend telling him that something terrible had happened. Salvadoran soldiers in the middle of the night had invaded the campus of the Jesuit University and massacred his entire Jesuit community, including the rector, our author, Ignacio Echeverria, along with their cook and her teenage daughter. I remember how Sobrino, still traumatized, called to tell me he had spent the past weeks writing a book-length essay, Companions of Jesus, which we told him we would be honored to publish. Sobrino lived on to publish many other books, but among his most personal and poignant writings were those occasioned by martyrdom, not the abstract theology of martyrdom, but the concrete assassination and massacre of friends, colleagues, mentors, family, and countless members of the faithful. He accepted the burden of representing those whom death had silenced. In one of his essays, he concluded by naming the victims of his community, writing, "May their peace give hope to us who are still alive, and may their memory not let us rest in peace." It seemed to me that Sobrino should be regarded not just as a great theologian, but a confessor of the faith. And so I was deeply affected in 2006 when the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a document admonishing Sobrino for supposed, quote, erroneous or dangerous propositions that could harm the faithful. It began by saying that while his concern for the poor was admirable, he was wrong to use the poor as a primary lens for doing theology. Among other things, it upbraided him for suggesting that Jesus in his humanity came to understanding his identity and mission over the course of his life, whereas many church fathers had argued that Jesus possessed full access to the beatific vision while still in his mother's womb. And if you doubt me, you can look that up. Whatever the merits of this document, it seemed to serve as an example of the kind of abstract theological reflection rooted in what both Sobrino and Echeverria characterized as unreality. Of course, Latin America was not the full range of Orbis's work. We were one of the primary publishers for those involved in the church struggle in South Africa. To this day, our best-selling author remains the late Dominican theologian Albert Nouwen, author of Jesus Before Christianity. And I remember getting up at dawn in 1990 to watch Nelson Mandela being released from prison after 27 years, accompanied by either side by our authors Frank Chikane and Alan Bosak. Many factors had contributed to the downfall of apartheid, but in a country deeply invested in the Bible, the church struggle in South Africa and the work of theologians had played a very significant role. And there were other small victories. I remember the day that Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti, a liberation theologian, a priest of the slums, an implacable foe of the dictator Baby Doc Duvalier, was elected president of Haiti the same week as our publication of his book, In the Parish of the Poor. If Voices from Latin America had inspired a focus on the social implications of the gospel, our program was also inspired by the theological agendas of other parts of the world. From Africa, we highlighted the theme of enculturation, the development of non-Western ways of expressing and celebrating the gospel. For our 50th anniversary, the Jesuit Hekima Journal in Nairobi devoted an entire issue to the contribution of Orbis in stimulating and promoting African theology. Through authors such as Jean-Marc Ela, Mercy Odeyoye, Kwame Bediako, Lamin Sane, A.E. Orobator, Lorente Magesa, and I should mention Emmanuel Katongole from Notre Dame. Meanwhile, Orbis authors from Asia were grappling not only with issues of poverty and enculturation, but also the reality of religious pluralism. In India and South Asia, spiritual pioneers like the Sri Lankan Aloysius Pires and Raimon Panikar asked why Greek philosophy should function as a privileged medium for understanding the gospel. Was this not akin to the early precondition of circumcision? Why not Hindu and Buddhist philosophy and metaphysics? Religious pluralism was displacing liberation theology as a target of Vatican concern. A new list of Orbis authors came under scrutiny. Sri Lankan Tisa Balasuriya, Indian Jesuit Michael Amalados, Vietnamese American theologian Peter Phan, Indian spiritual master Anthony de Mello. The investigation extended to Western theologians who took up these themes. Jesuit theologian Jacques Dupuy, who literally edited the Standard Manual of Church Doctrine and taught at the Gregorian University, was subjected to a Kafkaesque process over his book, A Theology of Religious Pluralism. Ultimately, we were required to include a copy of the CDF document about his supposed ambiguities and errors in future editions of his work. The same went for the work of the American Jesuit Roger Haight, whose Jesus Symbol of God was reproved by the CDF. He was informed that he was no longer permitted to teach or publish theology. Meanwhile, in the 1990s, we became alert to the emergence of the scholarly discipline of world Christianity. This reflected a new assessment of the history of Christianity as a world Christian movement, instead of the traditional story that began with the early faith of the Jewish followers of Jesus, which then was supplanted by a Gentile church that followed the contours of the Roman Empire. The new historians realized that Christianity from the very beginning had been a world movement, with unique expressions throughout North Africa, Ethiopia, Syria, Iraq, China, India, and elsewhere. And so the new recognition of a world church in which demographic and theological energy was shifting from the north to the global south was actually more of a return to the church's origins. Much of this work was inspired by the great Scottish historian Andrew Walls, whose first book we published, The Missionary Movement in Christian History, was named by Christianity Today as one of the top 100 books of the 20th century, one of 3 Orbis books. Gutierrez's book was another. But it was also in the 1990s that we began to explore another hitherto neglected dimension of the world, namely the reality of the earth and our place as creatures on a planet increasingly threatened by the effects of human carelessness and greed. It was Leonardo Boff who first made the link between the theology of liberation and ecology in his book, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, Cry of the Earth. This became the cornerstone for a new Orbis series, Ecology and Justice. And in the years that followed, the concern for the earth became another paradigm shift in theology, recognizing that Western theology had been among the factors contributing to an exploitive relationship to creation. New authors included Dennis Edwards, Elizabeth Johnson, Catherine Keller. In a similar way, our view of the world continued to expand beyond the limits of this planet. Rooted in half a dozen books by and about the Jesuit Pierre Terre de Chardin, we published many books exploring the significance of quantum science, the new cosmology, the implications of an evolving universe. And this brought us to the work of authors such as Ilia Delio, John Hott, Brian Swim, Thomas Berry, and Dermot O'Murku. In the meantime, building our commitment to marginalized voices, beginning in the 1980s, we had turned increasing attention to such voices from our own North American context. This began with the publication of the work of James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology. Eventually, we published and reprinted all his work, and this opened the door to a wide program in Black and later womanist theology. I dare say this made Orbis, by any stretch, the primary Catholic publisher in this area, with classic works by Dolores Williams, Kelly Brown Douglas, Vincent Harding, Brian Massingale, and Sean Copeland. These works enabled us to meet the huge surge of interest in racial justice during the Black Lives Matters protests of 2020. In that time, James Cone's classic, The Church The Cross and the Lynching Tree sold 20,000 copies in 3 months. Similarly, we were on the ground floor in publishing the work of Hispanic theologians, beginning with the work of Virgilio Elizondo, also of Notre Dame, and I have to acknowledge Tim Moravina for his work in promoting Virgil's work, as well as Orlando Espín, Miguel Diaz, Roberto Goizueta, and Mujerista theologian Ada Maria Isasi Diaz. While making a place for new marginalized voices at the table, we were also broadening our program to include a major emphasis on spirituality, publishing many of the great spiritual writers and prophets of our time: Dorothy Day, Henri Nouwen, Thomas Merton, Daniel Berrigan, Joan Chittister, Richard Rohr. And even with our limited program and small staff of 9 or 10, we began to be increasingly recognized for our unique place within the world of Catholic publishing. But none of this prepared us for the new era that was to begin with the papal election in 2013 of Jorge Bergoglio, the first Jesuit, the first Latin American, the first pope to take the name of Francis. It became quite obvious from his first words and gestures that his choice of a name pointed to a larger agenda. He took the name of a saint who renewed and transformed and reformed the church by recalling it to the image of its poor founder. Instead of an inward-looking, self-referential church, he emphasized a mission-centric church, an evangelizing church that goes out to the frontiers, the margins and peripheries. He was not frightened by theologians who explored the frontiers. In an address to theologians, he called for a theology immersed in the world, not an armchair or purely seminary theology, but one that takes seriously the lived experience of people in their daily lives, in relation to the troubles they face, in response to the existential concerns of people today, and the existential threats facing civilization. In his first trip outside Rome to the island of Lampedusa, he established the plight of migrants and refugees as a signature theme in his preaching and ministry, closely connected to the preferential option for the poor. Without this, he said, proclamation of the gospel risks being misunderstood or submerged by the ocean of words. His overseas pilgrimages took him to places far from the beaten papal track: Iraq, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, South Sudan, Azerbaijan, and Myanmar. And this was mirrored in a selection of cardinals from some of these places, a vivid representation of the arrival of a world church. These initiatives did not require any great adjustment in our program. In a sense, we had been founded for this moment. Altogether, we published 25 volumes of writings by Pope Francis, including his writings on care for creation, his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, for which Dan Horan wrote an introduction, his exhortations on holiness in the Amazon Synod, but also writings on mercy, against war, on synodality, and care for refugees. We did this not because we were counting on the Francis effect for sales. In fact, few of these titles covered their costs. We did this because his vision fulfilled the promise of a world church that embraces as its own the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men and women of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. After enduring many years in a kind of shadowland, it seemed at last that our work was welcomed and honored in the official church. Among the signs, the canonization of St. Oscar Romero, the Pope's welcome to Gustavo Gutiérrez at the Vatican, his invitation to Leonardo Boff to serve as a consultant on the encyclical Laudato Si. Recognizing John Sobrino at the Vatican, he told him, "Keep writing," to which Sobrino replied, "Do I have to?" And then there was his speech before the US Congress in 2015, organized around 4 great Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day. And that brings me to my own story. As David mentioned some of this, my journey to Orbis began 50 years ago in 1975 when I took a leave from college to work at the Catholic Worker. I wasn't at the time a Catholic and had never read a book of theology. I was drawn more to Dorothy Day's heroic witness for peace and service of the poor. She did appoint me to be managing editor of the Catholic Worker, which I did for 2 years, and remained in the community for 5 years, by which time I had become a Catholic, and I returned to Harvard to finish my college degree. During my time at the Catholic Worker, we didn't pay much attention to liberation theology. Perhaps we were inclined to accept the stereotype that it relied too much on Marxist analysis, that it was uncritical about revolutionary violence, that it tended to conflate the kingdom of God with social liberation. Yet quite apart from liberation theology, Dorothy and the rest of us were deeply aware of the changes occurring in the Latin American church. Dorothy herself had, picture of me when I worked with Dorothy Day. Dorothy herself had pointed prophetically towards such developments as early as 1962, after making a pilgrimage to Cuba just prior to the missile crisis. She believed that if Latin America's poor turned to Marxism, it was because of the failure of Christians to live out the radical message of the gospel. She said that Christians should outdo the communists in their zeal and their self-sacrifice, in dedication and service for the common good, those who are following the teachings of Marxism-Leninism, adding, "We are not going to win the masses to Christianity until we live it." I remember one time I was writing thank you notes, donors, a task we all shared, and I found a contribution from Ernesto Cardenal, and I wrote him to say how much I appreciated his poetry, and he replied from Solentname, urging me to go up to Maryknoll to meet his friend, Father Miguel Descoto, the founder of Orbis Books. I did not follow up on that suggestion, but it's one of those things in retrospect that makes you think that Providence was winking at you. Years after graduating from college in 1982, I got a fellowship to spend a year in Latin America learning more about the changing role of the church. This found me in 1983 studying Spanish at the Maryknoll Language School in Cochabamba. There in their library, I began to explore my first Orbis titles. I remember struggling through Gutiérrez's Theology of Liberation with a dictionary by my side, not for the Spanish, but for the English. And I remember staying up all night reading Boff's Jesus Christ Liberator, feeling at the end like the disciples on the road to Emmaus when their hearts burned within them. Meanwhile, all around me in Latin America, I was seeing evidence of the role that faith could play in empowering people, enabling them to confront systems of injustice and violence, inspiring them to act on the dream of a better world. In my travels, I met a lot of Maryknollers, but also heroic bishops, missioners, and ordinary lay people who seemed to be reliving the apostolic era of the church. Everything was new, everything seemed possible. And through reading other Orbis books, I was discovering the theology that underlay this reinvention of the church. It was the first time I really understood that theology was more than an academic exercise. It could be a force, a source of life, a calling, a resource in the struggle for a better world. Returning to the States, I decided to study theology at Harvard Divinity School. Meanwhile, acquiring the costly habit of buying just about anything published by Orbis. For me, Orbis was more than a brand name. It represented an ethical stance, an engagement with the most critical social and spiritual issues of our time. So you can imagine my reaction when I got a call out of the blue in 1987 asking me if I would be interested in becoming editor-in-chief at Orbis. Sometimes the work of providence in our lives is mysterious and hard to discern. This was not one of those moments. I accepted the invitation and never looked back. These were extraordinary times when there seemed to be a direct link between the books we were publishing and the unfolding of great historical dramas. From Seoul to Manila, from Nairobi and Cape Town to San Salvador, San Antonio, and Chicago, Orbis authors were connecting the gospel to the challenges of their time and place. Not all the bold hopes of those years were realized. In fact, many of them were dashed. But I came to feel that theological publishing too could be a force, a calling, a source of life, a resource in the struggle to build a better world, especially in a dark and wintry time, such as the time perhaps we're living through today. I saw this as a ministry, casting seeds, some of which would land on stone, but others that might find friendly soil. And now after 38 years, I've been at Orbis long enough to witness some of the fruits of those seeds. One measure might be the story of the Catholic Theological Society of America over the past 50 years. I attended my first conference in 1988. At that time, the society was overwhelmingly clerical, mostly male, mostly white. There were no Orbis authors among the membership. People gave respectful notice to our titles, to our little table, but we were very much on the margins. It would be interesting to correlate the evolution of the CTSA over the past 50 years with the gradual influence of Orbis books, themes, and authors. Today, a typical program of the society is suffused with themes seemingly drawn from our catalog, interreligious dialogue, feminist theology, contextual theology, mission, ecology, enculturation. The membership is mostly lay, much more multicultural. Every plenary session includes non-US speakers. 20 of the past 30 presidents of the Society have been Orbis authors. 15 of the past 20 John Courtney Murray Award winners have been Orbis authors, most recently Roger Haight and Steve Bevins. When Peter Phan won the award, he devoted much of his remarks to thanking Orbis, saying, "I know I speak for many of us in the society who found a place at this table because of Orbis." 3 years ago, marking my 35th anniversary at Orbis, I was very touched and honored to receive a letter signed by all 29 of the living past presidents of the CTSA, honoring the contributions of Orbis. It said in part, "We, the undersigned, current and former presidents of the Catholic Theological Society of America, testify to the significant and very important role that Orbis Books has played in the world of Catholic theological publishing. Your editorship has truly lived up to the name of Orbis, world, by bringing out books that make us all the more aware of God's world with special attention to the poor, the marginalized, and those who are suffering." Kathy Hilkart was one of the signers of that letter. Thank you very much. But perhaps the most significant and meaningful affirmation of our role came in a letter from Pope Francis to mark our 50th anniversary in 2020. It describes better than I ever could the role of a mission publishing house in our time, so let me share that with you. And there are copies of the letter I'm happy to see out on the table there. You can take it. He wrote, Dear brother, thank you for the letter and the books you sent me, as well as for all the efforts you make to sow, even against wind and tides, a culture based on fraternity." And I love the sort of reference to sowing and the unspoken fact that many of those winds and tides had come from the Vatican itself. I join in thanksgiving for the first 50 years of the journey with confidence that our Father, who sees even what is done in secret, will reward you. It's comforting and hopeful to know that among your editorial priorities, you do not seek to promote only scattered, trending, or interesting topics for release, but that you want to offer a true horizon of meaning toward which to move, a vital horizon in these pandemic times in which we are able to note more clearly some of the wrongs that have already affected us for so long. We never come out of any crisis the same. Either we come out better or worse, but never the same. This was, of course, written during the COVID pandemic, but I think the lessons apply to we could substitute the crisis of our current moment. He goes on, and that will depend to a large extent on our capacity to cultivate, especially in the younger generation, an imagination that would help them believe that another way of writing history is possible. We need to recover memory and give voice to those who made our history great, a history that is glorious because it was forged in sacrifice, in daily struggle, in the lives given that believed in the dream of God. How good it made me feel to remember the servant of God, Dorothy Day, who found in the Gospels and in the lives of the saints the source of inspiration that marked all her life and mission. I believe that reading in that sense can have a powerful role and become a compass that points the way, guides and allows us to cultivate a spirit capable of moving toward great goals that embrace the good that awaits us all. In this sense, I encourage you to continue your work in that difficult but important and delicate task of creating accompanying volumes that give flight to the spirit and help reach the places where new narratives and paradigms are being formed. The health of a culture is also measured by its capacity to pool its best resources and awaken the best talents to create networks of solidarity that allow us creatively to build new alternatives to what affects us today. I thank you again for your kindness and work. I assure you of my prayer for you and your family, that the Lord may bless you and the Holy Virgin take care of you. And please do not forget to pray for me. 2 years ago, I was able to have a brief encounter with Pope Francis during a general audience. I was in Rome because the Vatican Publishing House had reprinted our edition of Dorothy Day's From Union Square to Rome with a foreword by Pope Francis. In my few moments, I had just a little time to introduce myself. I was holding a prayer card for Dorothy Day, which he immediately recognized and said simply, "Dorothy Day." After he died, I compiled a volume of his selected writings drawn from the many volumes we had published. I titled it, "I'm a Mission on This Earth," which which is one of my favorite lines from Evangelii Gaudium. My mission of being in the heart of the people is not just a part of my life or a badge I can take off. It is not an extra or just another moment in life. Instead, it is something I cannot uproot from my being without destroying my very self. I am a mission on this earth. That is the reason why I'm here in this world. I'm grateful for the circumstances that allowed me through Orbis to be part of this publishing program at the service of a world church, not, as Pope Francis says, promoting only scattered, trending, or interesting topics, but offering a true horizon of meaning toward which to move. If today the church that Pope Francis left us and over which Pope Leo now presides seems to be attuned to themes that Orbis has consistently promoted over 50 years, I don't mean to suggest that Orbis caused this. But we were a publishing house established with a specific mission at a particular time, with attention to the signs of the times and the work of the Spirit, attention to voices from the margins, to the role of faith in promoting a world of justice and peace, and fostering dialogue among different cultures and religions. In short, publishing for a world church, a phenomenon that was more aspirational 50 years ago, but is now increasingly a reality. Pope Francis has spoken of the need for what he calls a journey faith, a way that allows for doubt and uncertainty, a way in which we are guided by faith, striving to read the signs of the times. It is a journey in which we are challenged to leave our safety zones and sometimes to go to the frontiers, the margins and peripheries. God, he says, is encountered walking along the path. That has been my experience. That's what I've learned in my life at Orbis Books. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. There are 2 microphones here, so if you have any, please make your way.
I'm never shy about opening my large mouth,
Good.
but I can't thank you enough for the inspiring talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
One element that of the needs of the needy in Native American societies. There was large presence of Jesuit and Franciscan priests, as well as other denominations of Christian groups, that made the effort to deculturalize and Christianize Native people
Yes.
in collaboration with the federal government of the
Yes.
United States, all of which is documented.
Of course.
There's nothing that reflects the Native populations in these publications.
Well, the ones that I talked about, I'm sorry that I left out many other topics. And we have also published many books by Tink Tinker, Jace Weaver, Native American theology and religion, in dealing with some of that legacy as well. We just did a book called Sacred Resistance I forget what it has to do with groups that are protesting against, ecological devastation, including the work of many of the Native American communities. So absolutely, and I wish I could have covered every topic, but in our catalog you'll find them.
Yeah. There's a Jesuit priest.
We also did a very good book about Black Elk and spirituality.
A Jesuit priest by the name of Father Patrick Toohey, now retired by force by his provincial, who served the Native American population of Washington State. And he is publishing about the parallels between Christian beliefs and Native theological beliefs. He goes to Native publishers. And I don't understand exactly why, but he wants to work with them. And that's a voice that I would encourage anybody interested in minority groups might look into, is the work of Father Patrick Toohey.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just here to thank you. My name is Timothy Ertl. I'm retired from nearby Bethel College, but from 1987 to 1993, I was a librarian and lecturer at Jamaica Theological Seminary in the Caribbean Graduate School of Theology in Kingston, Jamaica. We were very low church, we were very evangelical, and you might have expected that we would have ordered from Erdman's or Baker or Zondervan or InterVarsity. But we found the one publisher we absolutely had to have a blanket order for during the time I was there was Orbis. And there was something about your books that touched deeply my students. And I thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Robert, that was a delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim.
So much. How did you manage to never have any negative repercussions from hierarchical figures in the church? Is there an episode in there you might give us that gives a little more concrete detail to the summary that you gave?
Well, I alluded to that story of Cardinal Egan. This was during the time when we were having the troubles about Jacques Dupuy, who was going through a really shameful treatment about this book. He was a towering theologian of great, honor and learning, who had spent decades in India and had taught at the Gregorian University and is a world-class theologian. And he was being treated like some seminary student who was getting a failing grade or something, having to go over and over producing explanations of these questions. One time he met with Cardinal Ratzinger, who said, "Well, explain this question to me." And he said, "Well, Your Eminence, that was in the, I gave you a 200-page response to that." He said, "Well, you didn't expect me to read that, did you?" Cardinal Egan during that time called Maryknoll and wanted to speak to the Superior General. He said, "I'm going to Rome this week, and I'd like to report to them that in the future all Orbis books will be submitted for imprimatur." And the Vicar General called me and said, what should we say about that? So I looked up in Code of Canon Law, and I scribbled out a little response. I gave it to him. And when the Cardinal called back, he said, "Well, what's your answer?" And he said, "Well, we have a response. I'd like to read it to you." "Read it to me?" Okay, so I said, "Your Eminence, we are very happy to continue the happy association that we had relationship with your predecessor, and we stand as always ready to comply with the requirements of canon law regarding imprimaturs for scriptural translations, for catechetical works, and religious education textbooks." He said, read again." So he did, and he said, "Well, that's not exactly what I asked for, is it?" And he said, "Well, no, but it's our answer." And he said, "So that's the little game you want to play." We never heard any more about it, So we managed to survive all of that and lived, to see a new dawn. And when that kind of concern that these theologians were leading the faithful astray at a time when many church leaders, many of those same cardinals, were utterly oblivious to the boiling scandal that was lying underneath the church and was about to lead many faithful astray. We're going after the LCWR, going after Elizabeth Johnson or whatever. So, it's a sometimes you live through a kind of wintry time with the hope of an irresistible summer or spring to follow, and I'm very grateful to have been able to continue and to live to see that. Dan.
Robert, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. My question for you is, following your methodology, a look back over Orbis's 50-plus years in your own journey through the experience of being at Orbis. As you're looking back, what do you see carrying forward? You left us at, several times made reference to maybe dark and stormy times in which we find ourselves. Indeed, they are. This is also a time in which there's a lot of introspection in higher education about the role of theology or Catholic identity at institutions like this and many others. Yeah. You have probably the most distinctive pedestal, having looked at and ushered in so many volumes of influential and important and timely theology. Where do you see theology going?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think that there have been different locations for theology in different, periods, whether it was in monasteries or, then pontifical kind of universities or then, secular universities. And maybe we're moving toward a time when theology will be written or expressed or lived in different ways by people who don't have the same kind of academic training. There's a among sort of ex-evangelicals, there's a gathering called Theology Beer Camp, where all these religious podcasters come together. There's a lot of people who kind of drifted away from the evangelical church and are just like, oh my gosh, didn't know about liberation theology, didn't know about black theology or whatever like that, getting very turned on by that. It may be other new subjects, who are going to be from their own experience. I don't know where that kind of paradigm shift is going to happen, but it may be, and of course I can't generalize from the U.S. experience is not the same as Africa or Latin America or whatever. But I think that there's also a kind of move toward kind of more narrative theology, more you could say spiritual kind of expressions of theology that are not so much focused on just in the kind of rational domain, but have to do more with the affective, aesthetic, and activist, kind of mode. A more pastoral, theology. I think that Pope Francis was trying to model, in which, I was saying to David, when he said that I'd prefer to have a church that is bruised and dirty from being out in the streets than a church that's all safe and clean and protected. I think you could say the same thing about theology too, and Orbis has been kind of part of that, of a messy, bruised and dirty theology in a way from being on the streets. You think of someone like James Cone, whose roots were not in the academy, but really were in the streets, in the protest, the reaction to racism in the 60s, death of King and Malcolm X. It's the Black Power movement, and you see also, let's say, or something like South Africa, the struggle against apartheid there. That, as I said, the religious front in that struggle was only one part of the struggle. And yet, because of the circumstances culturally in South Africa, it was actually a very important space for that. And I've sort of thought sometimes that maybe Orbis see ourselves as contributing to that religious front, that spiritual front in the struggle for justice, peace, ecological, care for creation, and who knows what it'll take to prevail on these things. But I would like to think that the religious dimension of that will be an important one. So I think engagement with those kind of critical existential issues of our time will maybe come more to the fore. Now, whether there'll be a place for that in the academy, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen now. The higher education in this country is under peril. Religion, humanities courses in general are under the gun. Theology departments, religion departments, even religious schools are closing. People are moving into science and computer programming or whatever. But I think that theology does not create that spiritual hunger. It's a reflection on it. And I think as long as people are moved, whether it's the crisis of our times or whatever, to feel a kind of existential thirst for transcendence and some meaning, new forms of theology will come from that.
Could I ask one quick question? You were talking about reading at one point, and I think that was in the letter from Pope Francis.
Yes, yeah, right.
Could you reflect just a little bit on the importance of just reading theology? I mean, you were mentioning just a minute ago theology coming from potentially not necessarily unlikely places, but places where it hadn't come from before. What about new audiences for theology, and how might Orbis be imagining cultivating new audiences?
Well, I mean, one of the areas of I think, development, that someone like Ilia Delio represents is as a new kind of era of conversation, dialogue between science and this kind of secular audience. A lot of her readers are secular people and scientists, and finding, through Teilhard and that kind of lineage, that there's this convergence of a lot of wisdom from different directions. That we're doing a book by a Spanish theologian named Victorino Prieto Perez, a brilliant guy, Panicar scholar, and scholar of everything. And he shows how this convergence between quantum physics, chemistry, complexity theory, eco-theology, world religions, and the scripture, Pope Francis, and everything, all pointing toward this essential ecological insight of how we're all connected, how everything's connected, and which represents a deep paradigm shift. The mystics have always said that, but from the Aristotelian kind of tradition doesn't look at things that way exactly, and so we're seeing how theology, maybe not just speaking to other theologians or just to the church, but finding ways of conversation with other disciplines and other communities can reveal that they actually have something practical and important to. When I think sometimes this has all been worth it, I just think of my own life about how just certain books that I read, changed my life, and can be a kind of seed, that can, you don't know what effect it's going to have. And I meet people all the time who say they read a particular Orbis book or something. Helen Prejean says that reading Jesus Before Christianity, changed her whole life. And I, whether it's, racial justice or peace or ecology or other things that I've been able to be a part of, I don't know. I write books myself too, I guess, so that's part of it. I write all these stories about saints because I really think that I've always been interested in the way that ideas are lived out in practical life, not just abstractly. And I think that by kind of sitting at the feet or apprenticing ourselves to the stories, the memory of heroic people, the best of us, that awakens possibilities or potential in ourselves for how we might live in a more faithful, honest, and courageous way, because we need a lot of honesty and courage in these times.
Please join me again in thanking Robert Ellsberg.